Yep.
Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We are starting. I think we have more than 150 participants and we are waiting the other registration, but welcome to our second webinar. We are organizing Istanbul PPP Center of Excellence and DEİK together this time. And I would like to thank you, our valuable speakers. Most of you know Thomas, Darrin, and Ziad. Thank you very much. I know you are so busy, but you are with us. The chairman of OECD Infrastructure Forum, Mr. Thomas, the partner EY of Australia, Darrin, actually, and the president of WAPPP, World Association PPP Units and Professionals, Mr. Ziad. Welcome again. Let me tell the first methodology of our discussion today. We separated two parts of our webinar. At the first part, we will get the presentations and the insights of our valuable speakers, and the second part, we will start to get the question and we have Q&A session. So during the presentations of our speakers, please write your questions from the Q&A boxes that you will see at the bottom of the screen. You can write from the chat box or I think Q&A box, and our colleague will collect the questions and I will try to forward your questions. So we have 1 hour, more than 1 hour to discuss your questions. And okay, let us start the discussion now. Most of you know me. My name is Dr. Eyup Vural. I am the chairman of Center of Excellence and the DEİK PPP committee as well. And my new duty came from the Ziad. Thank you, Ziad, for the chair of CIS chapter of WAPPP. And I think it is the hardest duty for me. Thank you.
We're very proud to have you, Eyup. Very proud to have you with us.
Thank you, thanks, Ziad. So as many of you know, very well, COVID-19 has a very strong impact on the infrastructure sector, as well as the PPP projects. And now there is on the ground, there is a very strict separation among the PPP experts and professionals. On one hand, actually, some PPP experts and professionals believe that this COVID era will have a negative impact on the PPP projects and the infrastructure sector. But on the other hand, actually others, one of me, including myself actually, strongly believe that post-COVID-19, I think infrastructure PPP will not be an option and maybe will be a mandatory tool for the governments in order to deliver public services. What we will see, what will happen actually. But in any case, it goes to the risk management. So who will manage better the risks? So what will happen among the stakeholders, which starts from the public authorities, private sectors, lenders and the people. So how we will shape this risk management and these metrics in post-COVID era. So my first question will start for all of you, and we will start with Thomas, then Darrin and Ziad. You have 10 to 15 minutes or maybe 20 minutes, and I know Darrin has a presentation, so we will get your presentations. And the question is, what we will we see in the new world in terms of infrastructure sector, a more conflicted world, more digitalized world, or more green world? What will happen for the PPP projects? How we will manage the risks, and what will happen to infrastructure sectors? So the floor is Thomas, is yours, and we are starting to listen to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eyup, for this invitation to join Darrin and Ziad and yourself, as well as your many participants across the globe. I'll focus, in a certain sense, on creating a central narrative, because even though we are all very shaken in many respects by the economic effects of the coronavirus, the current position seems to be that we have seen increases in uncertainty as to what the future is going to bring, rather than indeed any more predetermined position. To keep things as simple as one can, the general consensus, whether one deals with the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, or national authorities, is that the impact on economic growth is going to be very substantial in the short to medium term, lessening over time. The OECD has, in effect, said growth will halve as a result of coronavirus. And as we have also seen, in one respect very positively, but with a certain downside, the impact on public finances has also been very, very significant. And I say positive because the public authorities have been prepared, both nationally and multilaterally, to respond to a degree that they did not know how to do had they not had the experience, or they would not have known how to do had they not had the experience of the financial recession 2008-2012. So great number of lessons have been learned from there. Great deal of public thinking has changed, I think, as to the role of public finance and the role of private finance. And all of this is, in addition, coming on top of what we already knew were the challenges and the difficulties of meeting everything on the infrastructure agenda related to the Sustainable Development Goals and related to the Paris Climate Agreement. So if we step back 6 months, we can already recognize that the agenda we had for infrastructure development globally, I will say it perhaps more bluntly than is normally said, I will say our agenda was in difficulty. It was quite clear. I cite the UN Secretary General who spoke in the UN last September. He really said, look, we are making progress on the SDGs, but in fact, we're only making about 1/3 of the progress we would have needed to make in order to meet the overall schedule. I think that is, I think, a perfectly fair comment. I think people had to look at that and see where we would go forward as a result. And I am not at all concerned by the fact that the ambitions were greater than the achievements. I think this is a natural relationship. But the degree of slippage on the SDGs was very considerable. And very few countries were indeed in the top 50% percentile of having achieved more than half of what they needed to achieve by that stage. I think the other point that is particularly pertinent as we talk about infrastructure provision and resourcing is that the expectations that the mantra of billions to trillions would actually deliver in the way that had been foreseen in 2015 after the Addis Ababa Action Agenda certainly has not been achieved. I think we have to face the reality that the concern of those who are trustees for the world's savings to ensure high quality of return and regulatory framework before they invest remains a fundamental barrier to moving excess savings from where they are to, for example, moving them to Africa, where the potential returns are every bit as good as they are in OECD countries, but where the perception of those who are responsible for managing financial resources is simply not the same. So let's try and pick some big points out of those different positions. We have a threat to growth. We have a threat to the future availability of financial resources. We now have, in addition to the challenges we had until recently, we have the addition of saying, well, how are we going to manage public finances in a way that continues to command the confidence of the credit markets and indeed the equity markets. And these, I think, are very considerable challenges and will pose many new both opportunities as well as many new threats. I think we also have to accept that irrespective of COVID, we already had, and we recognized we had, very considerable uncertainties in the system. I think if one looks at a recent report done by the Global Infrastructure Forum in Australia, they looked, for example, at the major megatrends for which industry and government recognized jointly that we were least prepared. And if I look at the emphasis that, for example, the private sector and contractors put, because these things were done on a sectoral basis, the contractors said the rise of natural disasters and resilient infrastructure was one of the biggest trends for which we were least prepared. Now, COVID falls into that category of natural disasters. Epidemics were not, or pandemics were not specifically addressed. The second major issue for which people perceived we were least prepared was the rise of climate change. Thirdly, even though there is a positive side to this, was the rise of artificial intelligence and automation. A fourth point, which infrastructure professionals will recognize very deeply, either the aging of infrastructure in mature markets, or indeed the creation of infrastructure in emerging markets. So here we had a perception that we already had a set of issues. COVID is hitting us partially because of its direct economic impact, partially because it is creating uncertainty as to when and how we are to emerge from this particular crisis. Now, if we look again at some of the broader things that we already know and we know well, there are things that are creating opportunities as well as threats. And we have to constantly create a rounded picture that gives full account for this. So before COVID, we would have recognized that urbanization and population growth was a major opportunity, and it had a huge impact or potential impact on private sector industry. The rise of green energy resources, equally a major opportunity on which progress was already being made. The rise of the Internet of Things, of sensors, of smart infrastructure, were things capable of having a major impact and which we are capable of addressing. Now, the infrastructure, I will call it investment gap rather than necessarily financing gap, was something that was also capable of having a major impact. And the just generalization of, shall we call it, geopolitical trends, which are changing the rules on which technologies may or may not be shared between countries. When we look at the capacity for countries to operate multilaterally under shared intellectual property regimes, all of these things are, if you like, part of the building blocks that we all carry around in our mind and we know somehow or other have been brought together. Now, it would be nice in a conversation like this to offer what I will call some deep insight of wisdom as to something that must inevitably happen or will guide things. Unfortunately, I don't think this is the scenario we're in, because I think we are facing perhaps three different types of scenarios. I don't think any one of them alone is likely to dominate. I think in the nature of things, there will be elements of each of these scenarios that will be integrated into the global picture. I think the global, if you like, the geographical distribution of ideas will be very different. And if we look at some of those, let's look at what I will call the green economy, which is the notion of sustainable development, working very much in line with the type of inclusive principles that the SDGs had sought to promote. That is one complete scenario. And I think it is fairly evident that many countries believe fundamentally in these objectives and in the desirability of these type of developments. And what is equally positive is that many corporates and most recently many investors, through examples like green bonds or sustainability bonds or climate awareness bonds, these type of things, investors also believe. So that's one complete collection of ideas. Now, there is another scenario which is almost the negative of everything of that. It is a world in which multilateral collaboration is much less evident, where trading arrangements, technology sharing, openness of markets, where these are not annihilated, but they are just restricted in a way that we had become accustomed to. So it's a form of deglobalization in many respects. And again, I think we have to recognize that elements of that, whether it is securing the supply of, for example, key medical equipment, whether it is creating a form of health cordon sanitaire that would not have been part of international movement considerations in the past, that these things are going to come into play and they're going to have to be integrated. And we have, obviously, intermediate examples where the private sector, for example, plays a much more considerable role than in the past. My perception is, as I say, fundamentally, those core scenarios are going to be mixed according to areas. You know, if we look at something like the developments in Europe and in other OECD countries, we can see very much the green economy, sustainable philosophy being the dominant political trend for the time being. But nevertheless, with considerable changes to take account of practical things that people are concerned about. If we look at the potential for Africa under the African Free Trade Agreement that is coming into operation right now, we can see a scenario where regional collaboration on trade, on technology, on employment creation, all of these things will be much more significant than they were in the past, but perhaps not as significant as one might have expected them in a completely globalized world. So I think we are facing, some particularly new challenges in creating a narrative. But as in all of these things, certain core elements of the puzzle remain the same. And, you know, if I look back at the debates we have had in Africa, I look at the debates we have had in Asia, I look at the debates in Europe, as to how do you get infrastructure right? We haven't changed the alphabet as to how you get infrastructure right. So the concept that you must have a clear strategic framework, that you must have a capacity to deliver, that you must have value for money, that you must have performance, that you must have inclusiveness. All of these things remain the same, but within a slightly different strategic framework. I think likewise, when it comes to the detailed, if you like, evaluation of PPP principles, nobody is going to doubt, I think, the basic core sense of the PPP principles set out with common accord in 2012 by the OECD. I think that is not the question. The question is, did those core principles enable us to deliver what we had expected to deliver? And I'm going to shade my answer in saying probably not as much as we had expected. And then secondly, to say, are those same principles sufficient to enable us to face the new challenge in which everything is going to be seen in a post-COVID prism? So, in summary, I think we have made, at a public policy level, at a private sector level, we have made very considerable progress. I think the fact that we created a common framework through the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015 and onwards was an incredible step forward. We have to recognize, I think, right now, that the climb up the hill of achieving that has got somewhat tougher, and that we are going to have to find ways of facing those challenges, learning from the particular experiences we've had in recent years, but also learning to focus our solutions in the most appropriate way to the requirements of the region and the country. Now, there was a phrase that came to mind when reflecting on all of this. When we were in a more comfortable position of resources and had more time, we could afford, shall we say, to experiment with different policy solutions. And to some degree, that was a luxury. I think right now we're into a position where, both in terms of public finances, employment creation, need to deliver a higher level of public service result. I think the pressure on all parties, public authorities, perhaps to the forefront, but also the private sector, to get the decisions right is actually that much greater. So, you know, we welcome diversity in thinking, we welcome diversity, but in fact, we cannot, I think, be quite as relaxed as we have been in the past in terms of when it is we will achieve some of these results. Because for some countries, a much higher proportion than is comfortable, their public finances are not at a sustainable level. And unless we manage to address those questions, our problems will multiply rather than decrease. That's a rather somber way of looking at it. I have been in this particular profession of infrastructure and economic and social development for a long time. I'm fundamentally optimistic that we can make it through. I don't doubt that. I see great potential in many places, but I do recognize that the challenges now facing us are that much tougher than perhaps we had ever thought we wished to see. I leave it there for the moment and welcome questions from all of you on that.
Thank you for this valuable contribution and insight. Actually, as a summary, there are a lot of important points that you mentioned, but what I got, it's maybe we will see a very slightly change in public things. This is very important, but paradoxically, I think you are talking about deglobalization, but also maybe in the near future we will need more and more knowledge sharing between us, how we will create infrastructure, the right infrastructure investment for public services, which more green, which are more sustainable, which are more resilient. So it's a big challenge. We will see how we will, make this exchange between us. We will see. Thank you very much. Thank you. So, Darrin, I think you have a presentation, and
Sure.
can you share it?
I will try to. Let's hope the technology works for me. First of all, thank you, Eyup, for inviting me to join this webinar. It's terrific to be involved and engaged with the DEİK, PPP, and the COE. And I'm only the big downside for me from COVID is that I won't be able to visit your wonderful city in November by the looks of things for PPP week, which has become a major fixture on my diary for the last 6 years, and I will miss it dreadfully. I do hope everyone online is safe and well. These are extraordinary times. I don't think, well, I know I have never experienced anything like it in my lifetime. And I hope that we will never have to experience anything like it again within my lifetime. But we're not through it yet. You're to be commended, Eyup, to bring together this forum to share experiences and ideas. And I thank Thomas as well for that presentation, that talk. I think I hope I complement that. You talked at the strategic and the global level. I'm going to get a little bit gritty and into the pricing and the risk allocation at the project level. So I hope I complement what you spoke about. Certainly, increased uncertainty is a feature of what I'll talk about. I do have a few slides, but they're really by way of bringing some graphics to some graphs to illustrate. Now, let me hope that this works. If I share screen, I hope that I will be able to share this with you. Hopefully you can see that.
That's great.
And I will put it on presentation mode. Is that visible?
Yes, now it's good.
Yes, thank you.
Great. Well, technology worked. I thought for a moment there I'd have to call in my 17-year-old son to make it happen. Okay. So I'm going to talk a bit about COVID-19 and the impact on PPP and project finance. But actually, where I want to start is the last crisis that we experienced. I want to start at the 2008 global financial crisis. And I want to do some comparison with that crisis. The reason I want to do that is because both have had profound effects on project financing and PPPs, but in quite different ways. And one was, of course, the 2008 crisis was, of course, a structural crisis in financial markets caused by the collateralization of mortgages, principally in the US, and the on-selling of those through CDOs that produced a virus of sorts, a contagion that ravaged the financial markets. And in fact, many places still haven't recovered from that period. And yet this one isn't a structural crisis to the financial markets. This is a health crisis. And it just so happens that that health crisis has resulted in a response which is causing an economic crisis. And that economic crisis is having an impact on financial markets, on risk pricing, and that is finding its way into the project finance world and public-private partnerships. So these graphs are just illustrative of what happened in 2008. And there's no doubt that COVID-19 poses financing issues that will lead to an increase in the cost of project financing in the foreseeable future. That's that risk pricing. Thomas spoke about the uncertainty principle. There's no doubt it will, but the question is to what extent. Now, prior to GFC, these graphs, by the way, these ones are for Australia, but they could apply to most countries of the world, certainly the OECD countries, but they would apply to most countries as well. They may the magnitude of the movements in pricing may be different, but the general picture I think would be similar. And prior to the global financial crisis, debt margins were at historic lows for project finance in PPPs, at least in Australia, certainly in the UK and Canada as well. And risk pricing was sub 1%, sub 100 basis points, driven by strong competition for infrastructure deals, the availability of credit enhancing instruments, low cost of finance, multiple sources of debt product, either from banking markets or from capital markets. And then you saw 08 enter the picture around the middle of that graph, and a dramatic spike in financing costs, going from sub 100 basis points, 1%, and in some cases shooting up to 300 basis points, 3%, before gradually and very gradually coming down. And in Australia, at least, it wasn't until around 2012, 2013 that we got down to a more stable period of between 1.5% to 2% risk margin pricing on debt product within the PPP world. And what you also notice about this graph is there was a long period of time between 08 and 12-13 before that that restabilizing. But you'll also see on here that mainly debt also became the predominant product. Capital markets in Australia closed and remain closed. Indeed, they were pretty much closed right up to this current crisis. Only a few deals were using bonds, whereas elsewhere that opened up. And I think if you go to countries like particularly within the North America and Europe, where capital markets opened up, competition, this graph would have come down further, and debt pricing would have been between 100 and 150 basis points. So that's the picture of the crisis that took place in 08, which we hadn't yet come out of. So in Australia, debt pricing at 1.5%, pre-GFC, debt pricing at sub 100 basis points. We also saw gearing, which is on the other side of this graph. We also saw gearing substantially impacted. The graph shows the pre-GFC and after GFC, where there was a shift in greater proportions of equity put into projects. And this is quite simply the pricing of risk and uncertainty, which Thomas spoke about, only in the context of a deep structural problem within financial markets. Remember that. So then we come to where we are now. So if I move to this next graph, this shows essentially this shows the same picture to the left with respects to US Treasury bills, and it also has the volatility index in grey. So the US Treasury bills are in yellow on your screen. The volatility index, which is measuring risk volatility, is in grey, and there's also the BBB rated corporate bond spreads shown on here in blue. As you can see, they all track. Then in 08, a big spike, but actually a more rapid than project finance, a more rapid return to levels, and by 12-13 back to levels pre the GFC. And then if you go to the right hand side, you can see what happened in February of this year. Because in February of this year, pretty much across the world, it became very, very apparent that there was a major health crisis. I know it seems strange to say this now, but take yourself back to that period. I remember January and February very well. I came back from holiday in the summer here in New Zealand, and I was hearing stories of people getting sick in a place called Wuhan that barely heard of in my life. And then rapidly, this contagion spread. And then by March 13th, and I remember the date very well, March 13th, Friday the 13th, I stopped going to work in the city, and I haven't been back since. And the spike here at the right is dramatic. It went off the charts, basically. Compared to 08, it went off the charts. But then if you look to the right, you can see that on the right-hand side, what then happened, it came back very, very quickly. And this is the reflection on the financial markets in a deep period of uncertainty immediately, and then beginning to realize that, yes, there was an economic problem, but it wasn't a fundamental problem, a structural problem within financial markets. It would become an economic problem, and we know that now, but essentially it was a health problem. And so very quickly things came back to not normal, not near normal or pre-February, March, but stabilized a lot quicker than they did during the GFC. So what does that mean for PPP projects? Well, in Australia, at least, through 08, 09 and 10, next to no PPP projects or project finance deals got completed during that crisis period. Next to no deals got completed. Very few globally got completed, reached financial close, or contracted to move on to the development phase. But what have we seen during the COVID-19 pandemic? We've seen an extraordinary number of particularly people involved in what I would characterize as knowledge working or financial markets working, who are able to continue to work through this crisis. The very fact that we're having a webinar now, and we've got people from all over the world tuned in, is testament to a significant technology change since 08, even 08, let alone before that with previous recessional economic cycles. People have continued to work, and indeed we've counted 30 PPP projects have reached financial close during this crisis so far. During COVID-19, 30 projects have reached financial close that I could count, 5 in Asia, 12 across Europe, 10 of those in France and Germany, 7 in North America, and 6 in the rest of the world. Nothing got done in 08, 09, nothing. And yet we've seen commerce and activity happening. You know, I can on my notes here, I've got some of those projects. I can just give you a bit of a flavor. They are across sectors. I can't pronounce all of these, but a commuter rail project in China at about $2 billion US for a rail through Henan Kunyi city, being built under a BOT. It closed on the 4th of May, 2020, closed on the 4th of May. A PPP in North Germany, an A3, that's a road, a $1 billion project, 79 kilometers of 6-lane expansion to the Bavarian highway between, I can't pronounce the cities, my German is not very good, but that closed on the 7th of April. And the list goes on. I can even go to the UK, where Gatwick Airport closed a facility for nearly $300 million. In Canada, a highway PPP closed for a couple of $100 million US on the 7th of May. And the list goes on. So this is not the same kind of crisis as 08. This is very, very different. So what are the learnings from 08, and what are the differences that we're seeing now in the market? 08 the GFC saw liquidity completely dry up around the world. Extreme volatility with risk pricing shooting to 300 basis points. That's 3 times the risk pricing on debt product to pre-GFC, followed by an extended period of stability, but never a return to the pre-08 rates. Mini-perm debt structures became the norm. That's short tenor, and refinancing became a risk which we hadn't talked about in PPP projects in the early 2000s and in the 90s. So suddenly we had a new risk we had to deal with. There was consequential impact on refinance risk and also terms and conditions relating to market disruption. Significant market disruption clauses were introduced into deals to deal with financial contagion. Interestingly, we're seeing the same thing to do with pandemic and the definition of a health pandemic, which wasn't contained within all of PPP projects' force majeure clauses. Margins increased during the crisis. As I said, they did not return ever to pre-GFC levels, at least within the decade before we hit another crisis right now. Capital markets took some time to come back, but they came back strongly in North America, strongly in Europe, less strongly in small markets like Australia. No availability PPP financings took place during that GFC period. None at all, compared to 30 odd projects during this COVID-19 period. There were a number of greenfield PPP transactions during the GFC, but they tended to close afterwards, and it took some time to move those to close. Whereas close was taking maybe a year for a PPP project, suddenly it took 2 years, 3 years even. So what have we got now? Well, we've got liquidity, and we've got quite a lot of liquidity. 30 projects suggest that the financial markets are well and truly open and are trading. They might be pricing risk a little bit higher, but they are trading. Not as much disruption to PPPs and project finance markets. A significant feature of this crisis is infrastructure stimulus, fiscal stimulus and infrastructure stimulus. And that is ramping up rapidly and should bolster the marketplace in infrastructure going forward. We do need to be cautious about that, and investment needs to be targeted, and contractors are becoming risk averse. They're using the crisis to move back on risk positions that they would otherwise have moved forward on. And in many ways, that this reflects the same things that Thomas was talking about. There needs to be a shift in our thinking. And I do agree with both the Global Infrastructure Hub's recent report that they've brought out on infrastructure, but also the measures, and in particular, the comments that Thomas made about needing to take the big issues to plan better. Diversity, I would add there, with gender in particular, safety, environment, social inclusion and inclusiveness, and also disaster mitigation, which Thomas spoke about. We need to build that into the design of the future projects. But just returning to stimulus briefly, there's a lot on this slide. It's not meant for people to read. This is just 7 or 8 stimulus packages already announced around the world, with massive amounts of public money coming into what's termed fiscal stimulus. But a lot of this money is being channeled now towards built form and infrastructure development. Indeed, in my own country, just today, announcements about stimulus directed at building works at the housing level. And governments here in Australia, and the next slide is Australia, oh, I don't have the next slide, sorry, it was on an earlier version. Governments in Australia are talking about which sectors to direct infrastructure stimulus towards. And of course, whilst big transport projects and very large road projects are tempting, they're actually plant and equipment heavy, whereas building projects are labor heavy and are much more effective for stimulus. So point infrastructure in social amenity around healthcare, schools, justice, or housing will be much more effective at directing stimulus money into the pockets of workers and into the economy to affect stimulus. So I'm just going to finish up with a few comments from people in the infrastructure market here on this slide, and I think it goes to there's David Baxter from World Bank. Of course, David is a good friend of many people on the phone, and a good friend of Eyup and mine. DLA Piper, and there's also the International Monetary Fund there. Making comments about short-term impacts of COVID on issues in the market, but also the long-term impacts around government stimulus. And the sums of stimulus that are being talked about are truly staggering. And you know, the early stages of seeing have been to protect jobs and get cash into workers' pockets, as I've said. That's with direct financial injections, principally to workers who've been furloughed or who have been who've lost their jobs. But the next stages will be a double-edged sword, as the title of this webinar correctly states, because there's going to be lots of money coming into the market, but it's about encouraging the right kind of economic activity. And that goes back to Thomas's points, back to the point that rapid policy in a disaster situation with large sums of money can be wasted if we do not keep ourselves focused on what essentially is smart planning and sustainable infrastructure development. So I'll leave it with that and pass on to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Darrin. This valuable contribution. Actually, totally I agree with you. And from the point that Thomas mentioned, he continued, we don't have any financial gap. We have an investment gap. So yes, there is a very big challenge in front of us, but I think all the governments and the shareholders who are working very closely with the governments and the infrastructure sector will find the way these challenges, I think. So, and maybe additional points to you. Next week on Thursday, the first PPP project, the tender will be launched in Turkey. It's around $200 million. It's a Denizli-Aydin highway. So the life goes on. Yes, you're right. So, and the 15th of June also, you know, the PPP hospitals stories in Turkey, you know, very well. Actually, we mentioned that the PPP hospital, more than 10,000 beds has been completed in Turkish PPP stories. So 15th of June, 3 new PPP hospitals will be launched. So it's around 5,000 beds. So everything is gone, and we will find a way to avoid these challenges. You're right. And okay, so the last one is Ziad, the president of WAPPP. And thank you, Ziad, for participating and for accepting my invitation. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Eyup. Thank you very much. And I am privileged to be with you with such an audience and also with such distinguished panelists. And I enjoyed everything they had to say. Interesting how every one of us, without coordinating before, has come to the subject from a completely different perspective. So I'm going to take more an approach that's related to the production of PPP projects, if you like. Now there are scenarios that Thomas talked about, and GI Hub report mentioned in slightly different ways, and I totally agree that it's going to be a mix of those, and we're not going to see just one scenario. It is very unlikely. I grew up in Lebanon, and I am in Beirut today, and I can tell you that from our experience here, going through wars and going through major disasters, and you know, life goes on. Do not despair. This is not the end. The pandemic will be over, and we're all going to go back to our offices, and we're all going to go back to work and doing PPP projects. So the thing is, yes, there are some major global events that are taking place, the relationships between the US and China deteriorating, and what that is going to have, what impact that is going to have on anything from supply chains to availability of financing for projects for the Belt and Road Initiative or the US's initiatives with MCC and OPEC and others. Yes, you know, this is, of course, this going to happen. But I think on a global level, there is I would say the main thing that I'm worried about, to start with what I'm worried about, is availability of funding for emerging markets. And yes, it is true that there is liquidity. It is true that, you know, we're seeing governments react by quantitative easing and other methods around the world. But really, the problem is that this money is geared towards their national markets. And it is not geared towards assistance, funding, or, you know, it is not going to the multilateral organizations in a big way. There's additional funding now by the World Bank, et cetera, to deal with COVID, but how long this will last. I think that we are going to eventually go through a period where interest rates will have to rise somewhat, maybe not a lot, but they will have to rise somewhat to restrain some of the inflation that might follow the additional liquidity pumped into the markets. Any rise in interest rates will affect emerging markets negatively. But I don't think this is going to stop PPP. I think we're going to find a lot of PPP projects that are going to be done. Now, but I think this COVID-19 situation has been extremely interesting because it should act as a wake-up call to all of us. All of us should now take a step back and say, how was I dealing with PPP programs and with PPP projects, and what should I do differently? And I think most of us started dealing with PPP projects as, you know, it's like we got ourselves within a box. And PPP is about sharing of risks. And this is how you do it. You do 1, 2, 3, you know, and then you have a PPP project. And you come up with guidelines and you come up with best practices and you do it. Yeah, it's true. And how do you deal with risks within that box, in that framework? Well, risks are allocated. The whole thing about PPP is allocation of risks. And these risks are going to be borne by whoever bears them best. So these risks will go to the private sector. These risks remain with the public sector. And here are a few risks, force majeure among them, that are going to be perhaps shared. I think we need to get out of the box and rethink this. It's all risks have to be shared. All risks have to be shared. There's no risk for the private sector, risk for the public sector, and shared risks. Now, does that mean that all of the risks have to be shared equally? Of course not. There's going to be risks that we used to think should be 100% public sector that should now be 90% public sector and 10% private, and vice versa. The point of, we need to go back to the point of partnership. And yes, we used to define, and many textbooks still would define the partnership in PPP as a partnership in risks. Yes, it is a partnership in risks, but we have to see it more as a true partnership. If it is not a partnership, then we're getting nowhere. So I mean, there's the concept of affectio societatis, which is Latin for, you know, the reason or people coming together to form a company. And why do you form a company? It's because you have a will to work together towards a certain objective. And if there is a will here from the government to provide services through infrastructure to the public, and a will from the private sector to actually provide these services, well, there's a confluence of objectives, and we need to go back to that. can understand this at a public versus private level, but I think it should go even deeper. We need to, sponsors of a particular PPP project have to start thinking in terms of partnership. The SPV, the relationship within the SPV has to be a partnership. You cannot go saying, well, you know, the contractor isn't finishing the project on time, so I'm the operator. I'm going to sit back and wait for the contractor to finish the project. No, I mean, I think we're going to see a lot of the PPP contracts going forward written in such a way where everybody's responsible. So you're going to have the contractor or the operator putting pressure on the contractor to finish early, as well as the financial investor in the SPV. I think we're going to move towards avoiding penalization and emphasizing cooperation. I think that, and my colleague Mark Freelet talked about this in a recent webinar about what's called a rebus sic stantibus. It's like, this is how the way things are. This is in legal concept, and this impacts force majeure and impacts the concepts of hardship and impacts the concepts of MAGA, with material adverse government action risk. So it is basically saying, and this is like in international treaties, we are agreeing to this as long as the circumstances are such. If the circumstances change, this agreement has to be renegotiated. This agreement has to change. And we used to say that PPP contracts have to be flexible and they have to allow for, yes, and even more so today. We have to go into that thinking this way. Now, this is not easy. This is not easy for PPP units. It's not easy because they have the government, you know, that doesn't understand. You have a lot of politicians that don't understand PPP. You have general public that doesn't understand PPP. Why are you privileging that company? Why are you letting that company get, you know, change the contract that they agreed to? Why are you now, you know, there was certain level, I mean, this was supposed to be a user pay contract, and now the government is stepping in and making some availability payments. So I think the general public would need to be educated, because they need to figure out that it's not, I mean, making an availability payment when it was supposed to be 100% user pays PPP makes sense in order to keep that public service going. Otherwise, it's not going to go. These are some things that, I mean, they would require capacity training, both for PPP unit staff to understand how to deal with new contractual arrangements. And it would require some raising awareness, like I said, among politicians. Now, one thing that can be done, and that we have been talking about for many years now, I think, at least in our context, is you know, is sustainability. And sustainability is best, you know, there are various ways of looking at this. I mean, there's the financial markets look at ESG, environmental, social, and governance related dimensions. In PPP, many of us look at it as people first PPP. And how do you make sure that a project is going to serve the interests of people? So looking beyond the value for money to the value for people. And that will, if it's structured right, if all the stakeholders are involved, etc., it's going to give it sustainability. I think with COVID-19, these continue to be very important, of course. I mean, value for people is even more important than before. But I think some of my colleagues, like Domingo Peñalver, for example, talks about value for future generations. We're looking at projects that might be 20, 30-year terms. They're going to affect national budgets. They're going to affect the life of future generations as well. So this element has to be taken into consideration. I would personally add a fourth element, value for the economy. value for the economy as a whole, value for happiness, value for standard of living, value for social well-being. These are maybe difficult to put a value on, but I mean, at the end of the day, if we structure projects with all these things in mind, then we can, you know, they'll be more resilient and more capable of withholding the kinds of, you know, interruptions or black swan events that we have, like with COVID-19. We are never going to be able to predict black swan events. By definition, they hit us, you know, out of nowhere. So we're not going to be able to do that. But you know, we can. There are other things we can do. I mean, in Lebanon, for example, our experience with the war situation has been that civil society can play a very important role. PPPs with NGOs can be a very important part of the prescription for the future. Our government stopped functioning during the war years, and during, some people would say, still doesn't function. But civil society actually is carrying the nation, and they do anything from drug distribution to taking care of the elderly to all sorts of things, and these are, you know, social project PPPs can be done definitely through NGOs. There's a lot that I want to talk about regarding the mitigation of risks in this new environment, but I'm conscious of the time that we have. I'll just point very briefly to, you know, some things like Islamic financing that we usually don't think about, and Islamic financing is by definition geared, you know, it's not waiting for you to pay the interest at the end of the month or the quarter. It is by definition more of a partnership approach with you. I think the future, we're going to see a lot more emphasis on ICT in PPP. You know, we have gone from major infrastructure, and of course this is still needed, to social infrastructure, and of course we need a lot of that. And I think that the next is digital infrastructure. We're going to, drones. I think drones are going to be a major part of PPP. You know, anything from regulating their use to how they're used in logistics to you know, their impact on or the impact of AI and traffic management on that. I will finish by saying, and I'd be happy to take questions about other things about the risks, but I will finish by saying that the most important thing to my mind in the coming decade or so, since I see that there might not be enough financing for emerging markets, is I would love to see multilateral development organizations and banks spend more time funding development of local capital markets than funding the construction of dams on rivers or things like that. I say this because there is money in emerging markets. It's just not channeled well like the money in developed countries. In emerging markets, we don't have major stock exchanges, we don't have major bond markets, but yet there is local money. And if local capital markets are developed, we will see funding in local currency that will avoid the foreign exchange risk, which is, you know, major problem all the time for all PPP projects. It will avoid a lot of the interest rate risk that we experience. And you know, I think that this is going to be something that I would love to see them work on, providing, using their capital instead of to fund loans, using their capital to fund guarantees, guarantees for projects, and also guarantees for bond issues. If we, you know, bond issues, especially in local currency, if they guarantee bond issues in local currency in many emerging markets, they would be helping those markets develop tremendously. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Okay. So thank you very much for your valuable contribution as well. I think we should work harder. It seems like that.
Yes.
So maybe we will focus on, yes, the types and the new models, maybe the solutions against the challenges. But also what I got from your contribution, I think the nature of some public services will change in near future. Maybe we will talk more about some soft public services, not hard construction, highway toll, but also maybe we will use technology, innovative solutions, and some AI solutions for public services in near future. We will see. Thank you very much. So we have a lot of questions from the participant. I'll try to make a filtration. So I will start from the more general one to more specific one, if you want. And the first question is a positive distinction to David, our friend. So I will start with the David's question. So he mentioned, I believe we need sector-specific policies and regional specific policies. Every PPP is different. So what are your suggestions? So maybe we will keep the same rank. We will start with Thomas, if you mind. So what are you thinking about sector-specific PPPs in the future and the regional PPPs? Thomas, can you unmute? Okay.
Thank you, Eyup. That was very helpful. And thank you both to Darrin and to Ziad, I think, for some very welcome, I think, adding of depth to this discussion of PPP development. To pick up your questioner's query, one of the things that has been absolutely essential in ensuring that we can deliver infrastructure in an appropriate way according to the circumstances of each country or each region is actually the development of what we will call organizational capacity. Now, the needs, whether it is in Turkey, whether it is in China, whether it is in India, whether it is in Europe, take different forms. But essentially, part of what is going on is that people have, by virtue of their knowledge of their local regions, they have the profound understanding of what the risks are and where the potential solutions lie. Now, I'll go to Ziad's last comment, which he specifically was addressing to the development of domestic capital markets. To my mind, this is actually one of the fundamental issues, because if we look at the savings capacity in many markets around the world, we actually find that even in the poorest of economies, because they are poor, they actually save very considerably to the extent they can to cover for future uncertainties. But the use of those savings is not necessarily most strategically well used for the future development of the country. Now, therefore, the concept of developing local capital markets to using the leverage capabilities of the multilateral development banks, the IMF and other players like this, and let's not limit it just to those players. Because when we look at the global lending of the multilateral development banks, of which there are 9 that strictly meet that criterion at the moment, we're talking about lending of the order of $750 billion each year. If we look at the next layer of national development institutions, the German KfW, the various other ones like Agence Française de Développement, various others in Italy and Spain, etc., etc., and then you take in the Japanese, the Chinese. The capacity of these institutions is approximately triple each year what in fact the multilateral development institutions are doing. So we must not blind ourselves to the fact that because the Bretton Woods institutions, if you like, dominate the scene, that they are the only ones who can make a major contribution. But I think the 2 points that come out, the development of organizational capacity and expertise to enable each country to actually see the solutions that are best suited to delivering its strategic vision. That is fundamental. But I think, and this is the obverse of the point that Darrin was making at the moment, we are undoubtedly in the fortunate position of good liquidity, thanks to the extraordinary efforts taken by the central banks, both of Europe, of Japan, of the United States, etc. We rather hope we will not come to the end of that capacity. We hope never to find out what the end capacity is. But the reality is we do not know. So therefore, when we look at the capacity of international institutions, we recognize that in fact it is indigenous financial resources are significantly more important than international financial resources. And that if we do not organize, if you like, the organizational capacity plus the financial mechanisms to draw on savings and to take out various risks, such as the one Ziad referred to as the Forex risk or various other things, or political risks that domestic markets do not recognize they have, but international markets recognized excessively that they have. So I think there is, in answer to your question, to your questioner, there is that dual focus that said organizational capacity, development of the indigenous financial resources of each of these markets go hand in hand in finding a better way forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Darrin, do you have any comments?
Yes, and may I say hi to David. I've been thinking of you just recently, David. You're living in Washington, I believe. So obviously the news reports we're receiving of the situation there have been quite horrific, and I do hope you're safe and well. I think you've hit the nail on the head. One of the biggest issues with anything new, like a PPP policy or guideline, is that you can't go and impose it on somebody or some country or some region. That just, history suggests that kind of approach really doesn't work. And I'm having worked extensively in Australia and the UK, but having been through my region in Southeast Asia and experienced some of the particularly the ASEAN countries who are trying to develop infrastructure and use alternative procurement models, it's very apparent that the local knowledge, the expertise that is in country is critical to delivering projects, and it's critical that support that they get in those countries is for their own policy development. And I think most development agencies are beginning or have realized this and appreciated this. And what I think is needed to achieve what David suggests, and is for there to be much more government to government, geopolitical connections that support the fundamental foundations of policy and that development in country, rather than any notion that you can homogenize that and just lift it out of a country that successfully delivered projects either through sectors or within their regions, and think that that's going to work elsewhere. That's a pathway to failure. So long way of saying I wholeheartedly agree with David.
Okay. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you.
I think Thomas and Darrin have answered, and I would say the same thing. It is, I agree, and there are, my one concern about regional strategies and projects is that they're very difficult to achieve by nature. I mean, either they are sort of guided by some big plan like the Belt and Road Initiative, and then questions of who has how much say in them, and transnational projects are by definition, when they're not like that, when it's just two governments or two regions within a country having to sit and negotiate something, it adds complexity. But yes, we have to eventually, there's going to be more need for integration because our entire planet is integrating. I mean, we might be having today a reaction against globalization because of loss of jobs, because of the world became culturally very small too quickly. All of a sudden, you're sitting in Italy and you have somebody from China on the screen in front of you, or on your social media, and vice versa. And so we all are facing some cultural shock. But I think eventually, I mean, all of this is going to work itself out. We're a small planet. We're going to integrate. Technology is going to bring us together. We'll have to work across nations. We'll have to work across sectors. I mean, medical sector, healthcare, etc. Okay, this is great in the COVID-19 era, but we see today that a major, what contributed most to our well-being through this COVID-19 era, aside from the health sector, is the ICT sector. If we didn't have this way of doing webinars and continuing and working from home, etc., what would we do?
Thank you, Ziad. Actually, I will forward some specific questions to each of you, and I will start from Thomas. I tried to group of some questions. So I think the attractiveness of PPP project in the future and how we will promote them to private sector. So this question comes to the Thomas. Why do you think private sector will continue to have interest in PPP when there is a likely slowdown globally? So this is for you, Thomas.
Thank you. It seems to me that we do ourselves a little disservice by focusing on PPP as though it were a standalone concept. To my mind, it is part of a spectrum. In each of the things that we're doing, let's call it in strategic infrastructure, things that matter to the national economy in one form or another, the public and the private sector are already natural partners. And the question, as Ziad was talking about, as he talked about the evolution of PPP concepts, is that what worked in the past may well work in the future, but it may well also be time to have a certain evolution of the nature of those partnerships, whether it is more intensively public or more intensively private, according to sector, according to country. All of these things matter. Now, when we look at the question as put by the questioner, there is going to be constraint on the total resources available. Therefore, governments are going to be seeking what we will call value for money for the limited resources they have available. So there is going to be a demand side to that market. It is going to be up to the individual and indeed the collective sector responses of different countries as to whether they find the term sufficiently attractive, or whether in fact they prefer to leave what has been a distinctly important part of the public policy market, just to leave it and to say we have better options. If they have better options, they will take better options. The reality is, I do not think that the question will be posed in that way. I think we will see both public and private sector trying to make maximum utilization of their resources in the best way possible. And therefore, without putting any specific form on it, I rather follow Ziad's comments to say the nature of the PPP relationships will evolve over time. To some degree, they have to evolve over time, because in some of the more mature PPP markets, we have seen a decline due to lack of public confidence in transparency or in value for money. We cannot afford actually to lose such important investors, whether from the viewpoint of their knowledge intensiveness or their risk capacity or their flexibility or other things. We need all of the players in this market. And therefore, I think the market will continue. But how precisely it will evolve, I think, is going to depend very much on regional circumstance.
Okay. Thank you. Darrin, question is coming to you from Dr. Irfan from Dubai, one of my close friends. And so we are the floor with Irfan because you are the person who started PPP for us, Dr. Irfan and me. Thank you for this, Darrin. We started, both of us, we started with your article, the PPP stories. Thank you. So he is asking actually about the model, the future model of PPP in terms of financial and risk allocation. So which model actually will be very popular? Let's say it's popular, available to payment or user payment PPPs. What do you see?
Yeah, I'm just getting the question up on my screen. Thank you, Dr. Irfan. That's a very, very good question. I think both the merchant risk model or the toll road model or the user pays model, depending on which sector you're in, I think it will experience, and the availability based model where government makes payments on behalf of users, but both are going to experience headwinds, notwithstanding my positive feeling about the financial markets and risk pricing and the continuation of infrastructure stimulus and PPP projects in particular. There is no question that there's going to be an impact around risk allocation. I mean, you just take transport. Just take transport, a toll road, where the risk of tolls being insufficient to cover what are very large sunk development costs, construction costs. Think about that in the context of of many economies where congestion and road usage has virtually evaporated overnight, and remains in many countries still subdued, coming back, but still highly subdued. Roads look busy, but they're probably only running at 30 or 40% of pre-volumes in some countries. And think about what we're doing now and what we've been doing for the last 10 weeks working from home. Is there going to be a major shift in behavior which undermines the very business model upon which some of those transport projects have been built and make them unsustainable? Do we have to rethink the risk allocation of merchant projects as a result of that? Think about the availability projects where perhaps the time and cost factors of development are much more important to establish what that payment might be, and think about how workplace practices have been disrupted, how social distancing in the workplace means that it's slowed down development, led to delays, increased cost. How does that risk allocation get priced into the future or on existing projects? So I think that notwithstanding my positiveness in my presentation, the post-COVID era, especially from a risk allocation point of view, and the financials flow from that, really could be changed quite dramatically. We just don't know yet in what form or in what direction. We can paint scenarios around those risks, and I mentioned a few in my presentation. But there's no doubt that revenues are going to be under pressure, and there's no doubt that the construction delay and cost and supply chain are going to be different, and therefore risk allocation is going to be challenged and will need to be redesigned going forward and into the future, and potentially on existing projects that are either being developed at the moment or are in development.
And Darrin, a quick question to you. I think it's from Kazakhstan. Do you expect any legislation change in Australia response to?
I've been trying, the ones that have been directly to me, I have been trying to tap out a quick answer to. And I was just responding to that one, actually. It's a good question, and that's from Almas. So thank you, Almas. I'll speak to it as Eyup has invited me to. The short answer to that is that I've been expecting changes to the PPP model in Australia, irrespective of COVID-19. For anybody who's been following the Australian market, the significant move into very, very large mega projects, particularly in the transport sector, that has seen sizes of project move from very large projects 10 years ago would have been 5 billion. Very large projects now are 15, 20 billion and rising. And they're all in the transport sector, and they all involve linear project risk, and many of them involve tunneling, and many of them have come under significant pressure, both in design, but also in execution. So I've been expecting, not necessarily legislative changes, but I've been expecting policy changes around risk allocation for some time now. Will COVID-19 impact that? I don't think any of us know yet, but some of the things that I've raised around how it might lead to lasting impacts in the way in which our economies operate and in the way in which projects get invested in and realized is bound to lead to necessary changes in the future. What they are, I don't know yet.
Okay. Actually, I have a question to Ziad. Let's be a devil advocates, Ziad. Sorry for the question. But I think you are the only person who has nominated as a World Bank president. So I think this question should come to you directly. And after all, I will ask to Thomas as well, because now he's chairing multilateral institutions. So the new role of the MDBs, actually, and the multilateral institutions, what we will see from apart this question. And you mentioned, I think the audience needs a clarification about local currency and hard currency. I think you mentioned that. So I think we need a clarification how these developing emerging countries will handle this local currency investment. You know, maybe this is the exactly emphasis of our topic. This is a double-edged sword, local currencies and the guarantees about the hard currencies, which also we are now facing in Turkey. So please, can you clarify these local currencies and the hard currencies investment, the emerging market needs?
Okay, well, when I was talking to the executive directors in Washington, when I was running for the presidency of the World Bank, for the lack of a better word, my spiel to them was the following. You know, the World Bank has an excellent strategy, and it is codified in two documents that they have. And obviously, that strategy is the result of a cooperation of many intelligent people and many people with a lot of experience. So it was not about whether that strategy is right or wrong. I just saw that this strategy, that the CEO of the World Bank should be entrusted with carrying out that strategy. I felt that the president of the World Bank should play a slightly different role from perhaps the traditional one, and lead on elements that go beyond the strategy. I had three things in mind mainly. One is migration, because I think migration is a major issue for our planet. whether it is for countries losing brain drain, losing labor force, or countries that are experiencing influx of refugees, how to deal with them financially, culturally, etc. The second thing, and there are many things that can be done there to create jobs and whatnot. The second thing was about the use of what I was talking about, the use of NGOs and civil society. And I think that the multilateral development organizations or banks should not only be lending to the public sector and, like the IFC, for example, to the private sector, but there should be lending to NGOs. They're not there to make money, but they can still service debt. And you know, you can, and that's a whole different thing to talk about. The third thing was the thing about creating capital markets that Thomas, I'm very happy that he thinks like I do, mentioned. So, and there, you know, we all know that there are major, it's like the oil industry. So you have a lot of reserves in Saudi Arabia, a lot of reserves in Venezuela. All you have to do is dig a hole and you get oil. And this is what you have in London and New York. But like shale oil is fragmented in rocks here and there. You need to frack it to be able to get access to it. And this is how money is in emerging markets. It's just fragmented. And you need to frack it and you need to collect it. And once you have it, you know, you might think, well, yeah, but I mean, it's going to differ from country to country, of course. And some countries have small wealth that can be used in that way. That's true, but they usually also tend to be small countries and small populations. So, and you know, when they're talking about infrastructure, it's perhaps not as costly as infrastructure in India or Egypt or somewhere else. Anyway, the point is we're always going to have in emerging markets the issue of I mean, you mitigate every risk, and you say, okay, this risk I'm going to mitigate it with an escrow account, and this one I'll use an insurance policy, and this one I will get a MEGA guarantee on, and this one I will do export credit agency, you know, assistance with. But eventually you're left with some sovereign risk that I'm against giving guarantees for sovereign risk. It should not be blanket. It should be focused to the leftover risk, if you like, in a project, etc. But anyway, but the foreign exchange risk when you're funding a project with international investors is always the most difficult to deal with. You can look at mitigants like using you know, total revenue for a project, or total revenue over the life of a project, instead of looking at revenue for any particular small period. Or you can use elements like lengthening the concession period, like you can even bid contracts on that basis, like they did for the highways in Chile recently. But the thing is that there's the best thing you can do, and you cannot do it today, obviously, but we should work towards, is getting those local capital markets funded and operational. Sorry for the length.
Thomas, the new question for you, the same question, sorry. The roles of the MDBs and multilateral institutions, because you are chairing OECD infrastructure forum. So what do you think, what do you expect the new roles, especially for developing countries? I think most of our audience participating from those countries. And I have another question, maybe first of all, I will forward to you. It's come from Patricia, our friend from Peru. And actually you mentioned while your presentation, clear strategic framework. So she is asking how, you know, the countries, developing countries, make their right framework, strategic framework. What are the measurements? What are the criteria? What are the performance, you know, points?
Okay, let's take the first question of the role of the MDBs. it's useful to start with the sense of history. That when the Bretton Woods institutions were created, they really were created at a time when foreign exchange controls and other things like this existed in a massive way. And therefore, their capacity to bring money was in itself a major value added item and justification for their role. Now, over time, two things have happened. One, with a more integrated global capital market, the question of bringing money to the project has not been the prime value added of the multilateral development institutions. But let's be frank, a bank that doesn't provide money is not going to be widely appreciated. They must have a role in providing funding and in sharing risk, because risk sharing is very much part of their role. And there it goes back into some of the questions Ziad was pointing to as to what types of sovereign guarantees or undertakings or whatever should underpin that sharing of risk. But increasingly over time, what has been important for the MDBs has been the provision of expertise, of sharing of best practice, of sharing of, if you like, deep studies as to how to organize for the creation of a strategic vision for infrastructure or sectoral policy in each country. So if we even take the last 20 years, there has been a relatively radical shift where the MDBs were providing, let us say, 20% of total development capital 20 years ago on a global basis. They are now providing approximately 5%. But yet they're able to leverage that 5% by providing expert advice. What is equally important is that they have been making space for other players and diversifying risks, either by providing for national development institutions to come and play a role, or more importantly, coming back to the same core point, facilitating the development of indigenous financial resources. Now, that can go from the tax improvement collection capacity of an IMF technical study to the fact that over time we have seen, shall we say, the generation of resources from internal taxation moving from 13% to 15 to 17% in various emerging markets. Those type of improvements are not what you associate, strictly speaking, with the lending function of the multilateral development banks. But in reality, in financial terms, they are by far the biggest leverage effect. So be quite clear that the ability to provide technical and policy support to help national authorities make the better choices, to make them, if you like, to give national authorities the ability to say to their own domestic constituencies, we are doing this even though we know it is not necessarily the most popular national option, simply because it will give us the best result. Basically, the MDBs are serving as a quality improver, if you like, of the whole system. All of these type of roles for the MDBs are absolutely key. Now, for the time being, the MDBs are organized in different ways. That might well be considered a strength rather than a weakness, because some of them are capable of providing very much what I will call market-related advice, some of them very much public sector advice, others are doing different things specific to their particular mandates. So the role of the African Development Bank and the role of, for example, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in the new circumstances are quite different but complementary. And they have found ways of working together. I think where I'm pointing out these national development institutions, these are equally an enormous armory of the international as well as the national community. So bringing them further into that discussion, I think, is hugely important. And I think, Ziad, you also referred in passing to, for example, the role of insurance as a form of risk mitigation. I think one of the big initiatives of the World Bank in the last 4 or 5 years was to focus public attention on the potential role that insurance companies could play, on the question as to what is it that major corporate investors or major portfolio investors require. And we cannot get over the fact that most emerging countries, and indeed most infrastructure projects that we start to finance with, are going to be sub-investment grade when we start. We have to, however, take some comfort and get leverage from the fact. If we look at the credit statistics of the Moody's or the Standard & Poor's or whatever like that over the last 30 or 40 years, we see that the risk-related returns and the failure rates are not materially different in emerging markets than they are in OECD markets. And picking up Darrin's point and putting focus on it, even in the mature markets, we have distinct price premia for risk. But if we look at the price premia for risk in the emerging markets, we're looking at factors of 4 or 5 or 6 times higher, despite the credit statistics that show that the rates of return to investors and to lenders are not materially different. So we're touching a glass ceiling here that we have to find ways of breaking through. And I think the role of the development banks, by focusing on expertise, by developing organizational capacity, by developing financial institutions, by bringing in new tools such as insurance, by giving a policy framework such as the SDGs, we are changing the nature of the question that has to be answered. So let me go on to the question from your second questioner as to how you develop a strategic vision. Again, very fortunately, people are starting from a very established base. There is already very considerable expertise, both domestically as well as internationally, and the collaboration is there. Now, what the development of the SDGs did in 2015 was to simplify and clarify the overall purpose of the development agenda and actually give people a certain focus and strategic direction. I think it's a very simple answer to a very general question, but insofar as countries need to develop a strategic vision, it is by working both domestically as well as internationally to actually draw on lessons to be learned. Now, I think there is a statistic that perhaps is relevant to this. When the World Bank looked at the totality of its client base, all countries in the world effectively, it found, slightly to its discomfort, that approximately half of the countries with whom it was dealing did not have an integrated strategic plan for the development of infrastructure. They had some sectoral plans, they had some regional plans, they had various things, but they did not have something that, shall we say, was fully joined up. We recognize this is work in progress. Some countries are doing it particularly well. I think if we look, for example, at the ability to manage the entire infrastructure planning system, countries like Japan, countries like France, countries like the United Kingdom probably stand out by having the strongest governance system seen from the top down. Many other countries are focusing on bottom up and have yet to create an integrated structure. But this is the ongoing work, I think, that we're all engaged in. And I think we simply accept that you start from where you are, you work with the issues that you can best make progress on, and you move forward from there. But with the clear notion that if you can see strategically what you're aiming for, and again, I will pick up a reference that Ziad made in his comments, to emphasize the importance of ICT, for example. Well, ICT and all sorts of digital investment, as well as climate and sustainability investments, are now emerging as distinctly more important than we might have expected 5 or 10 years ago. There has to be a refreshing, even in the most mature markets, of their thinking on these issues to see what this means. And it may well be that the timescale, as well as the objectives for achieving some of these objectives, will change, sometimes accelerated, sometimes deferred. I hope that helps.
Very excellent. Thank you. Thank you. As we're wrapping up our discussion, I have one question for each. So I'm starting from Darrin. Darrin, what are the lessons learned from the COVID-19 period in terms of infrastructure sector and PPP especially? Can you list lessons learned they would like to learn, what we learn from this time? It's a difficult one. Can you unmute? Darrin. No. You should unmute. Okay.
It's getting late. Sorry about that. I made the same mistake as you. Yes, look, I think we're still learning. I think it's too early to say. I mean, that was kind of the flavor from what I was talking about at the beginning. It's way too early to say what we should take away from the specific impacts of COVID-19 on infrastructure, or indeed on PPPs. And I think it was Ziad that characterized well characterized black swan events as being unexpected. So it doesn't matter how much we prepare for the next COVID-19 crisis, it will be a different crisis. And I think the comparison that I was drawing with 2008, we're still learning lessons from the GFC that might be things we can draw on through this crisis, but only if we put them in context. One of the things that has struck me in COVID-19 has been the rapidity of policy response, which inevitably has unintended consequences. The nature of a health crisis is such, obviously, that well, days matter, let alone weeks. And as a consequence of some policy responses we've seen, those unintended consequences of those policy responses become quite quickly apparent, and they need to be fixed. And I think the same applies even in the medium term as we're moving forward with infrastructure. I think a lot of the fundamentals have been put in place. Thomas mentioned them, Ziad mentioned them, I referred to some as well. And I think it does come back to resilience and sustainability, and that unrelenting focus on the big issues that need to be planned for through infrastructure. And I go back to those big issues around ensuring that infrastructure is integrated, as Thomas spoke of, and that it deals with disaster mitigation to the extent it can, identify those disasters that we, the infrastructure may be subject to. It deals with issues of diversity, cultural, gender, ensuring that infrastructure is built in a way that's socially inclusive, and it deals with you know, the perennial issue, which I think we mustn't lose sight of, and that is the environment, and ensuring that infrastructure is sustainable for a rapidly changing environment around us. And I think that's the biggest lesson from this. Was two lessons really. One is that policy on the run can have unintended consequences, so it pays to think things through and get the fundamentals right. And secondly, that we have to take a long-term view, and short-termism, it won't serve us well. And that long-term view has to take account of those big issues, which Infrastructure Forum, the multilaterals, the Global Infrastructure Hub, that's what they're talking about. We've got to listen to them and put them into effect.
Thank you, Darrin. Thank you. And Ziad, you took very interesting points regarding NGO and PPPs. So I think we have a very good question about this NGO and partnership between private and public. So it means that we will see some alliance, some partnering. Let's maybe be more specific. Will we see some equity partner of public in the SPV, or something's the nature of new SPVs and the PPP? And the renegotiation framework, where the renegotiation will ended up for the contracts. Let's say it's 15 years contracts. So can you make a frame for all those two questions?
For the NGOs, I think there might be a different type of PPP. There would be more service-oriented PPPs than infrastructure as such. So this is like to deliver social services. Could be in education, could be in healthcare, could be in elderly care, could be in childcare. You know, there are many areas where NGOs can intervene, and they usually, because they have to depend on funding from donors, they don't reach their potential. And with better funding, I mean, you already have an enthusiastic group of people there, a dedicated group of people trying to get something done. And if we can empower them, I think that would go a long way. The renegotiation of contracts, I think, you know, it's not a matter of like waiting until there's a major catastrophe to renegotiate a contract. I mean, by then probably it's late, and probably you're reacting, you're behind the curve. What I'm talking about is more accompanying a PPP contract through its life. And as the circumstances of the market change, as the needs of the government perhaps change, or the population that is being served, its needs change, you know, make room there for a revision. You could have a yearly or bi-yearly revision of the contract to see how you can improve on it and how you can fine-tune it. The force majeure, hardship, and MAGA clauses can be reviewed as well and adjusted. Before I finish, allow me to do two things. One is to give our audience since this is about risks, give our audience a website, refer them to, which I think is excellent and is very helpful, at least, you know, to put a frame of mind. And it's the GI Hub site. It's ppp-risk.gihub.org. I think they will find there a very useful tool for helping them think through risks and mitigation of risks for PPP projects. And the second thing I want to say is, you know, the World Association of PPP Units and Professionals is open to individual professionals as well as to institutions. If you're interested in PPP, we would love to have you as members. You can contact Eyup or myself, and we're trying to grow this entity. We started a year and a half ago. We've experienced a lot of growth, and it's really a network for all of us to learn from each other, from each other's experiences, for individuals to find jobs, for consultants to find consulting opportunities, for PPP units to find investors, for investors to find projects. We're trying to build an ecosystem, so please join us.
Thank you, Ziad. And I think it's a very clear invitation to Darrin and Thomas, I think.
Sure, of course. We would be honored.
Will do.
Okay. So, and the last question, and maybe Thomas, I would love to, it's a wrap up all discussion. We have 3 minutes, something like that. So, you know, in the future also, the market needs more social infrastructure. I mean, the soft infrastructure, which projects cannot available for generating own its money. So needs some governmental guarantees, governmental, you know, supports. So it's a very big conflict on the ground. So how the government will handle this problem for social infrastructure, let's say it's sustainable, resilient, more green, digitalized PPP projects, how the government, especially for the you know, emerging markets, how we will handle this problem.
Okay. Thank you. I think there's an important point that was made by Darrin earlier that's important to build on. And it was something that the Global Infrastructure Hub also brought out, which was the increasing tendency towards mega projects. That can blind us to some very important developments on social infrastructure projects. Because if we look at the total expenditure on social and economic infrastructure, 80% by value, approximately, is going to projects of a unit value of less than $25 million. The mega side is there, it's big, it requires a different approach, but the social side is actually something which is much more lending itself to local involvement and control, whether it is by contractors, whether it is by municipal councils, whether it is by regional authorities or private enterprises. So there is that very big distinction. Now let me combine that with the question of the lessons we have learned to some degree. I don't know about you, but I have a sense of almost positive surprise as to what we have seen so far. Notably, in the flexibility with which public authorities responded and the speed with which they responded. And I will complete, if you like, a phrase that Darrin was using, the tolerance that the public have shown to the fact that public authorities made some obvious errors, but it was understood because it was understood as being necessary to get things done in the circumstances. And that is opening up a new form of, if you like, policy initiative, where demand management, where emphasis on communication, where different approaches than those that prevailed in the past has, I think, for the moment, got a very established credibility. You know, if we think of investment in healthcare systems, in any countries, whether emerging or mature, it doesn't matter, this was seen to be the most inflexible process imaginable. And yet what we have seen, whether it is in China, whether it is in New York, whether it is in London or elsewhere, we have seen the capacity of both government and the medical establishment to turn around and create field hospitals, to change your organizational structures, to win public support and trade union support and NGOs for a whole series of different approaches. Now, the important thing there is that it is saying to us, having long-term finance for long-term assets is not the only answer to the issues that are coming forward. We actually need a much more flexible approach. Certain things will have to address the needs that Darrin was addressing for the mega projects. You cannot do mega projects on the basis of an NGO goodwill to allow things go forward, or, you know, a hoped for financial resource. But what can you do in local communities, whether it is in Morocco, whether it is in Tunis, whether it is elsewhere? if what you need are community centers or tertiary healthcare centers or various things like this, you can work very differently. And I think from a top-down perspective, what the COVID experience has shown us is that there is a capacity at national level, at multilateral level, at population level, to accept a much more flexible approach than perhaps we had been building on or utilizing to date. Now, that just reinforces the implicit sense of your questioner, which is that social infrastructure is absolutely fundamental. It is, as far as the community support for PPPs and for public infrastructure, it is actually much more important, because the beneficiaries are so clear and this is so concerned with quality of community and family life, that these are the things that people really value. They do not object to the economic infrastructure, but they really find value in the social infrastructure, and that therefore that is something to be looked at. If we have to do it on an availability payment or a tax-based system, well, so be it. But again, we have changed one of the fundamental considerations of public finance in the last 6 months, in that we are looking at a much greater capacity of countries to actually carry public debt than we would have thought of in prior times. Now, part of that is being discussed very carefully and very nervously, because they're saying, yeah, it works while global interest rates are low. What would happen if we had inflation plus higher interest rates? It could be very different. But for the time being, there is a sense of openness there of things to be looked at again, and said, you know, it comes back to this notion of a strategic national plan. Where are our genuine priorities? I'll take, if I may, an example from Germany. Germany has been seen as having done relatively well. I don't want to put any particular qualifier on it, but they handled the COVID outbreak well because they had a capacity to deal with the vast majority of COVID cases at a local level in tertiary care or in doctor's surgeries. Very little of it went into the central primary care system. Now, other countries are now going to reflect on that and say, well, we had built a system that was totally centralized where everything went into primary care. Well, perhaps in the nature of things, that was not the right answer for the COVID characteristics. So flexibility like that, I think it all comes down to a question of saying, have we built a system that is fit for purpose? And sometimes we had built very fine systems, very expensive systems, but not fit for purpose. We need to get the strategic planning, the smart thinking, we need to get that done further. And we need to bring this into, you know, questions that are going to be very key to future education of future generations, of digital education, of utilization of ICT, of various other things that actually help us get over a whole series of things that otherwise we might have done in a very classical way. I hope that helps.
Excellent, Thomas, thank you. And Darrin, Ziad, would you say something for the wrapping up and for closing words?
I'm happy to go first, Ziad, and I'll be brief. I thank you so much to DEİK and the PPP committee and the Centre of Excellence there, and to you, Eyup, for inviting me to join this webinar. I've enjoyed it thoroughly, and I've got an enormous amount out of the fellow panelists of Ziad and Thomas. It's been a real eye-opener for me, and I hope it has been for the people who've joined the webinar and listened to it. Thank you for your questions, and look forward to when travel restrictions open up and I can come and be there in person in the future. Thank you.
Definitely. And Darrin, thank you very much. I know it's, I think, probably 11 o'clock there in Melbourne. So it's very late. Thank you.
It's 10 past 11, yeah.
Thank you. And
I will be very quick. I second what Darrin had said. I'm honored to have been on this panel with Thomas and Darrin. I thank everybody that listened to us. I thank you, Dr. Eyup, and your team for having made this possible. Thank you very much.
thank you. Thank you, Thomas. Yeah, and Darrin.
Thank you indeed.
Available support. Thank you. See you next
Bye-bye.
time. Bye-bye.
Okay.